Endgame is one of three phases in the game of chess. It is considered to be theoretical, meaning it has already been solved, which is why experts of the game recommend to study it first. In this video, we are going to talk about some basic endgame concepts such as the root of square, direct and indirect opposition, as well as key squares. I hope you learned something after this, and without further ado, let's get started. So first, let's talk about the rule of square. The rule of square is a tool you can use to determine whether or not a pawn can promote. Calculating the race between the pawn and the enemy king is enough to answer this dilemma. This calculation is not that complex, but experience has taught us a simple way to solve the problem at a glance. So it is the so-called rule of square. So first, let's start by advancing the pawn to a4. Actually, you can already start drawing a square from the starting position as such. So you have to remember that a square is a plane figure that has four equal sides. So you have to count the number of squares on each side, and they should be the same from all sides. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And if you count here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you'll know that your square is gonna look like this. And count 7 squares again downwards and count 7 to the left. So that's your square. And if you advance this pawn to a4, your square is going to be smaller. So your vertices are now a4, e4, a8, and e8. So those are your vertices when you advance your pawn to a4 in this position. So after a4, the king tries to prevent the promotion with king f7. So now we are ready to state the main rule. So if the king can reach the square, let me just draw this square again. There we go. So if the king can reach the square of the pawn, in this case, it's all these squares which are highlighted, then he can capture the pawn. If not, the pawn promotes. So in this position, the king does not enter the pawn square. Therefore, if we just play this out, we can see that the king does not catch up with the pawn and the pawn promotes. So it's as simple as that. So let's say after a4, let us set up the position again. Let's say the king is initially on f7 and it's white to move. So let's say we play a4 again. And as you can see, if we draw the square here and it's black to move now, you can see that the king enters the pawn's square. In this case, you can conclude that the king catches up to the pawn. So the pawn cannot promote. It can, but the king catches up and it's in row. So if when recalling the rule without whether the king must reach the square with his moves or he must already be inside, we shall observe this. If the king chased the pawn from the rear, so let's say, let's play a4, and let's set up the position. Let's say the king is on b3. Um, and let's say it's like to move. There we go. So if that's the position, and the square is still the same, its vertices are still the same. So here is what we'll observe. So if the king chased the pawn from the rear, in this case on b3, from b3, should he be inside the square before moving? Of course not. Therefore, it would be the same if the king came from further away, be it from the pawn's rear or from its side. So as you can see, it's white to move already. So the king has already made its move, and it's white to move now, and he plays a5. Let's say the king still tries to catch the pawn from behind. And as we play this out, you can see that the king does not catch up to the pawn. Therefore, the pawn promotes. We have just seen what happens in the two simplest cases. One, when the king does not support the pawn, and two, when the king supports the pawn by preventing the enemy king from standing in its way. However, the most interesting situation in a king plus pawn versus king ending occurs when the defending king occupies a key square in front of the pawn. Then everything depends on the relative positions of the kings. The first important position, which we must fix in our minds, happens when the pawn has reached the sixth rank and is only 2 steps away from the promotion square. Despite the proximity of the eighth rank, we will need to examine some positions before we grasp all the important details. In this position, the pawn can take its 2 last steps almost automatically. So let's play f7. So the pawn moves ahead, and black must retreat his king, and the white king can thus support promotion with king g7. However, the result changes completely if it's black's turn. The reason for that is that the pawn cannot promote if both kings are opposed when the pawn reaches the seventh rank. So then we say that they are in opposition, like here after black's first move, king g8. So for those of you who doesn't know the idea of opposition, I'm just going to show you for a bit. So opposition happens when two kings are facing each other. So the idea is that whoever whoever has the move loses the opposition. So in this position, the kings are opposed to each other, and let's say it's white to move. Therefore, uh, we can say that white is losing this opposition. And the idea is that let's say that this side right here, this area right here, is black's territory, while this area right here is white's territory. Or let's include this one. So this is a neutral space for both sides. So the two kings are fighting for these 3 squares in front of them. So the idea is the reason why white is losing the opposition here is the white king needs to move away from these 3 squares. So let's say white plays king to f3. Then after that, the black king has now control over one of these 3 squares. So that's the idea of opposition. That's the reason why whoever is moving, whoever has the turn, is going to lose the opposition. However, that all changes when a certain position comes up, just like here in our example. So going back to our previous position, it's black to move now, and supposedly, uh, the black king loses this opposition, but that doesn't mean that he loses the game. I got the position wrong. So the king is supposed to be initially on f8. So here it's black to move, and now black plays king to g8. So now white is supposed to be losing this opposition because if he tries to move the king away from these 3 squares, the king takes over one of them. But since we have an extra pawn right here, the white king can get the opposition back with f7. So now it's black's turn again. However, this does not mean that black is losing. So yes, the kings are opposed, and in this situation, almost always the side that has the opposition has the advantage, and the side to move is at the disadvantage. So as we mentioned before, opposition has gained an excessive prestige. In some cases, it is not so useful. If we want to make the most of it and not let it deceive us, we just have to notice how it suits us in each case. So something to remember is that in a king plus pawn versus king ending, king opposition is decisive when the pawn is on the sixth rank. So this is the first important pattern we must recognize. So after f7, the pawn moves ahead but cannot promote. So even if white does not play f7 here, let's say after king g8, white plays king to g5. White can play either king to f7 or king to f8 and still draw this. So the safest way for the defender to is to stay on the two squares available in front of the pawn. This fortress cannot be broken. If you have not done this before, it is worth observing and analyzing this simple sequence. So king to g5, king to f7, and then king to f5. Black plays king to f8 now, so still staying in front of the pawn, and king to f4, let's say, because if we go back here, then we go back to our initial position, and king to f7 again by black, king to f5, and king to f8, and let's say white now plays king to e6, trying to mix it up. If the defending king has always waited in front of the pawn, it is possible to get the opposition now that the enemy king must retreat from that file. So let's say black tries to take the opposition with king to e8, and now f7 check, king to f8, and king to f6 is stalemate because any other move is still a draw. Black just takes the pawn. So let's try to look at another sequence here. So let's say after black plays into g8, white now immediately checks the king with f7. So it's still the same result, king to f8, and king to f6 is draw by stalemate. So in this ending, we have seen that if the defending king, in this case the black king, if the defending king takes the opposition when the pawn is on the sixth rank, right, the pawn cannot promote. And if we go deeper, we also see that the major obstacle for the white king has been his own pawn. So therefore, we can conclude that one, the stronger side must not push the pawn too quickly. So as you can see, the white king has lost space for himself because the opposing king also controls the square that your king is controlling. So instead of having this f6 pawn, f6 square to maneuver to, uh, he cannot move there because the pawn is now occupying that square. And number two, the pawn should only reach the sixth rank in one of these two scenarios. One is its path to promotion is clear, or if its advance causes the kings to be opposed. But usually this only happens when the king has reached the sixth rank before the pawn. So let's take a look at another position to consolidate some ideas related to the sixth rank position. So our next position will focus on how to maneuver before the pawn reaches the sixth rank. So this regarding the starting position of the kings. When the pawn is on the sixth rank, their maneuvers are driven by opposition. And as we will see in the analysis, king to a6 is going to be played, taking the opposition, and black plays king to b8. And following this sequence of moves, so after king to c8, white can play c7, and king to d7, and white promotes. So before we wrap things up, let's take a look at another position. So most mistakes made in king plus pawn versus pawn endings occur in this position. The reason is that this situation is just provisional. The black king cannot keep the opposition because the pawn controls the f7 square. And the best squares for the lone king are those in front of the pawn. Otherwise, he may not get there in the right circumstances. This occurs in our next example, which is also important to find out why opposition is sometimes useless. But regardless, it's still important for you to understand it and to know it. So here, black loses no matter what, or no matter who has the move. If black is to move, the white king will immediately take the opposition on the sixth rank. And if white is to move, then let's play this out. King to f5. So white loses the opposition here. However, black cannot keep the opposition because, as we have mentioned earlier, the pawn controls the f7 square. And really, this is the area that we should be focusing on. So it doesn't matter if the king can maneuver over these squares because the path to promotion is happening right here. So wherever the black king moves, he loses the opposition. The important conclusion is once we take the opposition, we lose it if one of the squares we need is out of reach. So let's say king g8, and now the white king takes the opposition with king g6, king to f8, and we take the opposition once again. And the white king has gained the important sixth rank opposition and wins after these sequences of move. So white has now control of the promotion square, and the black king has nothing to prevent that. So I'm gonna wrap this up, and we're going to talk about key squares on the next video, and that will be a shorter one. So for now, just focus on the idea of having the opposition, having the pawn on the sixth rank, and the rule of square. So I hope you learned something, and see you in the next one.